This video covers one way to build a jig for reductive relief prints. Begin by cutting the linoleum to size. This plate is being cut to 5 by 9 inches. Choose linoleum that has hessian, the woven jute fiber, on the back side. This method does not work well without it. Next, plan the image. This plate will use the white of the paper plus 3 colors. As you plan, consider the order in which the ink will be printed. A general rule of thumb is to work from the weakest color to the boldest. That doesn't necessarily mean lightest to darkest. A transparent blue, for example, could be weaker than a bold yellow. It's helpful to list the order in which you plan to print the layers. For this print, it will be the white of the paper, then light green, followed by medium green, and lastly a dark green. You may find you need to adjust during the printing process, but having guidelines helps prevent you from missing steps. Next, take some measurements to figure out how large a jig is needed. Begin by adding an additional 2 inches on all sides of the plate. Then, add an additional 2 inches to either the width or the length of the plate. These additional 2 inches are to accommodate the holes needed for registering with the pins, and will eventually be trimmed off, leaving the print with a 2-inch border all the way around the image. Check your measurements twice. The jig for this plate will be 11 by 13 inches. You can of course adjust the size of the borders as you like, but I prefer to have a little extra paper to play with for reductive prints. The jig doesn't absolutely need to be the exact size of your paper, but this is helpful later on when placing the pins. Now you know what size jig you need. I've found medium density particle board, or MDF, to be the best material for this because of its durability and smooth surface. A 1/4 inch thick is my preference, but thicker will work, so long as it will fit through the press if you aren't hand printing. I found anything thinner than a 1/4 inch tends to warp when glue is applied to it. Following your measurements, carefully trace the block where you want it on the jig. Precision at this step will give you even borders later on. Now glue the block to the jig. Tacky glue and wood glue seem to work fine. Brushing the glue on so it's evenly dispersed helps prevent the corners from peeling up later on while you're carving. Wipe away any glue that squirts out along the edges. Bumpy, dried glue can make it difficult to get the packaging tape flush with the edge of the block. Lay down a sheet of wax paper and stack weights on top. Allow everything to dry overnight. While the glue dries, cut or tear your paper to size. For this plate, my paper will be 11 by 13 inches, the same exact size as the jig. Prepare all of the paper you plan to print on at once. It must be ready before you begin printing. With a reductive block, there's no going back later. Everything is printed at once because the block will be reduced further and further with each step. So if you plan to do 2 editions on different colored paper, both will need to be prepared in advance. Always, always plan to print extras. There will be mistakes. Mark a light X on the back of each piece of paper. This will reduce the risk of misregistration on the first layer, making it less likely the paper gets flipped. With the glue dry, you can transfer an image to the block or draw directly on it. This can be done either before or after the linoleum is mounted to the jig. For this plate, I transferred my drawing after the block was already mounted, using a laser print and a blending marker. The image will need to stay on the block through multiple inkings, printings, and cleanings, so I applied a thin acrylic wash over top to help seal the drawing in place. Stack the paper so the front of each sheet is face down. Then use a 3-hole punch to carefully punch holes in the stack. You may need to do this in batches depending on the strength of your hole punch and how much paper you are stacking. These holes will register with the pins that will later be attached to the plate. Now that the glue is dry, cover every exposed surface on the top side of the jig with packaging tape. The tape must be smooth and without wrinkles or texture. I recommend cutting the tape rather than using the serrated edge of the tape roll. Any texture can trap ink later on. I will be cutting and printing with the block glued to this surface. There is a strong likelihood that at some point ink will get on the jig. If left there, it would transfer to the paper during the printing process. The tape allows me to just wipe the ink off prior to printing. When finished, the entire top side of the jig should be protected with shiny, ink-resistant tape. If you choose pins that are shorter than the linoleum you are using, they will be able to go through the press without getting smashed, assuming you set your pressure correctly. With the tape in place, lay one of the sheets of paper print side down on the block. Line the paper up so it's squared. Take one of the pins and put 2 little strips of packaging tape on the flat side of the pin, sticky side down. Pop the pin into one of the pre-punched holes in the sheet of paper. Keep the paper lined up with the edges of the jig. Press through the paper to carefully stick the pin to the plate. Repeat this for the other pin. All plates need at least 2 pins for registration, but if you are working very large, you might find an additional pin helpful. Remove the paper and use more tape to secure the pins in place. Press down firmly to make sure the pins are secure. The pins will undergo a fair amount of stress, so make sure they're well attached. The jig and paper are now prepared, and the plate is ready for carving. There is an additional video explaining these steps.